Hello, and welcome to another Spotlight the Science, where we get to meet the researchers who have received funding from the American Diabetes Association. My name is Marlon Pragnell. I'm VP of Research and Science at the ADA, and today we'll be speaking with Dr. Grace Shearrer. Dr. Shearrer is an assistant professor of nutrition, and she's head of the Maternal to Adolescent Eating, Nutrition and Development Lab, the M2AENAD lab, in the Department of Family and Consumer Science at the University of Wyoming. She's also neuroscience faculty. She received her PhD in neuroscience in nutritional science at the University of Texas at Austin, and she did her postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Women's Health Research at the University of Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she's doing very interesting research. Welcome, Grace.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So tell us a bit about your work. What are you working on today?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks to the American Diabetes Association, I am working on an app that is a cognitive behavioral therapy that was developed by my mentor, Dr. Hedy Kober at Yale. And so it's called the Regulation of Craving Training. So she shortened that to ROC, and then I added teens at the end. And so what this is it's helping teenage girls control cravings for foods that we know are not optimal for health, things like ultra-processed foods, high in saturated fat, high in sugar. But it also is trying to promote the intake of fruits and vegetables, so foods we know that are protective against type 2 diabetes. And being at the University of Wyoming, really the most important part about creating a mobile app is creating an intervention that's accessible to rural populations. Because the data has shown that rural populations are more likely to die from type 2 diabetes. And a lot of that is just due to it's hard to get to a doctor's office from the middle of nowhere. And so having a mobile application really opens up who can access preventative care. And so right now we have built the app and we're testing it in teenage girls around Wyoming. But we're specifically focused on girls who are in Laramie, which is where the university is located. But also we have a research site in Riverton, Wyoming, which sits within the Wind River Indian Reservation, so that we can also reach another population that we know that is at disproportionate risk of type 2 diabetes, which is Native Americans.
Great. So I understand it's focused on like healthy eating. So to trying to kind of get young teens who are maybe crave foods that they might seen ads on or kind of processed foods and so on, to kind of get them to look at it in a different way, to look at food, to kind of sort of change their eating
Yes.
habits.
Yeah. Well, and so another really cool aspect of this app, which if you were using it wouldn't be obvious, but we know that teens they're tough to change behavior. And it has to do a lot with emerging autonomy. Teenagers don't want adults to tell them, oh, don't do that, that's not healthy, or you should be doing this. I'm sure if anyone has ever interacted with a teenager, they know that. But what teens do care about is being seen as autonomous beings that are capable of making their own decisions, and they don't want to feel like they're being fooled or tricked. And so what this app does, instead of framing the promotion of healthy eating in terms of health, it frames it in terms of emerging autonomy. So I eat fruits and vegetables because this is a way for me to take control of my health, is some of the messaging. But it also, we pulled some literature from the tobacco prevention data, that they've done a lot of work with teens and using things like big food companies, ultra-processed food companies refer to their consumers as users, which sounds very much like tobacco users or illicit substance users. And so we know that that also is very salient with teenagers. And so what I also really like about this paradigm is it moves away from the health aspects, which unfortunately get conflated with disordered eating a lot of times in this population.
Mhm.
And so we don't talk about weight or general health. It's all about more of this autonomy, helping your community, and not being tricked or fooled by food companies.
I understand it's kind of also too, it's kind of grounded in neuroscience, so it's kind of developmental in that you're targeting kind of the times of greatest development and also greatest risk of obesity and so on. So I know you recalled reading of that that adolescents kind of have a more developed kind of um, reward-based system as opposed to a rational kind of a clear thinking system, so to speak, and that guides it. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah. So it's really, I joke with colleagues who've known me forever, but they're like, "Oh, you went out to the University of Wyoming. There's no MRI machine there, and all of my background is in functional neuroimaging." They're like, "Well, what are you doing?" And I was like, "Well, I'm using all of that functional neuroimaging that I learned about, and now applying it." Because yes, we know from the developmental literature that the adolescent brain is rapidly developing, but it doesn't develop all at once. Different parts develop faster than others, and the reward parts of the brain develop faster in adolescence. And that's why we see a lot of classic adolescent behaviors of risk taking. So, oh, I'm going to skateboard down this ramp because there's a person over there that I have a crush on. And if I do this risky behavior, I'm sure they'll fall in love with me, that type of thinking. But this more risk reward behavior leads to a lot of the negative health behaviors we see in adolescence. So unsafe sex, alcohol experimentation, drug experimentation. And unfortunately, although not as serious as the others maybe, but unhealthy food consumption. So the parts of our brain that kind of control those reward behaviors, the frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex, they don't fully mature till around 25. So we have a long period of making what I would say silly, risky decisions before 25, when our frontal cortex comes in and says, "Oh gosh, I don't need to do that. I don't want to risk it." And so this app tries to work with the adolescent brain instead of against it, because we know that messaging about future health problems, if your prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed, you're not thinking about the future. You're going to be 15 forever, and it's going to be awesome. So instead of trying to focus on future rewards, we focus on that autonomy and the more social rewards that we know are important to teenagers and are actually more salient in the brain.
So you're trying to get to the teenagers, these young people, in ways that resonates with them, basically, in a sense. So, in a sense, instead of telling them, "Oh, the future, if you eat too much of this now, the future you'll have like heart disease and so on, or diabetes," what you're trying to do is kind of resonate with them, something immediate, something that is directly related to how they think and feel and so on at their level of development, right?
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's really bringing the science and then packaging it in a way that teenagers will care about, which is tricky. I'm 35, and I'm trying to write these essays that I think are like messaging that's going to be salient to a teenager. But luckily for me, I have great undergrads and graduate students in my lab who have been testing it with teenagers. And so we get feedback from them saying, "I don't know what you're talking about here." And a nice thing about teenagers is they will not hold their punches when they're telling you what they think of your app. But also the nice part about making an app is I have coded it myself. And so when we need to make a change, I just go in and will tweak it so that it's better, it's fitting our population better.
Interesting. So, I mean, as we get older, we kind of probably lose touch and sense of what are is relevant to young teenagers and so on, and how they see the world. How do you go about identifying those messages that
Yeah,
you want
that
them?
was that was interesting. So this using kind of more autonomy-based messaging is um, actually from one of my collaborators on the project, Dr. Christopher Bryant at the University of Texas at Austin, who oddly enough was not there when I was there. But he and his colleagues, and I believe David Yeager, came up with the value-aligned intervention model. So where you try to meet people's values. But the problem I was having is I know my own values, and they had outlined some that were salient to teenagers in Austin, Texas, but teenagers in Austin, Texas look different than teenagers in rural Wyoming. So we did a series of Zoom focus groups with teenagers around the state. Um, and we asked them things like, how do you feel when adults tell you to do things, both health-based and just non-health-based? And the answers weren't surprising. They don't like it. I don't like it when someone tells me this. And we also asked them why they eat their favorite foods. And again, not surprising, but you have to have them tell you. A lot of the girls said, I know that Cheetos aren't healthy. I'm not eating them because I think they're healthy. I'm eating them because I like them or because I've had a bad day or many other reasons. But it just really hit home that they're not uneducated or unaware, but that doesn't matter to them in that moment. And so it just really highlighted that we have to engage them on their level. Because if you start to be too pedantic, they're just going to turn that app off.
So you're going to the community then and getting feedback from them directly, the people, the potential users, about
Yeah.
what resonates with them, right?
Yes. Yeah. And another thing, so a big part of community work is just connecting with the stakeholders, which in a state like Wyoming, where I think there's 6 people per square mile, it's a lot of legwork. Everyone's really spread out. But I connected with our extension community through the University of Wyoming because they are across the state. They've been a wonderful resource. I also contacted high schools. And interestingly, the high schools, the first thing they asked me about when I said, I'm making this app, and they said, well, what do the parents think of the app? And I was like, oh, I just figured teenagers just download whatever they want. But that was an important one where we realized that we needed to also gain the trust of the parents of the teenagers. And so as we're beta testing our app, we have the parent and the teenager come in to the lab, and they both use the app and give us feedback on what they think. And part of this is just to establish that trust that, yeah, we want the parents' input, even though the app isn't specifically geared towards the parents.
Yeah, yeah. And I was reading some of your work, and you mentioned that only like 2% of young people actually eat the recommended amount of vegetables, and only 7% eat the recommended amount of fruit. Those numbers
Yes.
are terrible.
Yeah, they're really low. And unfortunately, the data is also a bit old because as a state, Wyoming hasn't participated in all of the national surveys for various reasons. Also, I sometimes think people are like, there's so few people there. We'll get, Utah and Montana, and we'll just assume Wyoming's the same. But yeah, really low fruit and vegetable intake. And that only became worse over COVID because when you live in a rural area, we really relied on the shipping. And if you're not shipping fresh fruits and vegetables when they're fresh, you are shipping gross fruits and vegetables. So we see that in rural communities, some communities might not have their own grocery store. Or if they do have a grocery store, they might not have fresh fruits and vegetables, or they may have a very limited amount of frozen and canned vegetables. And so part of that, I think, really is affecting what families can prepare for themselves, and then what teenagers, because they do have they're starting to drive, starting to get jobs and have their own money. But if there isn't an attractive fruit or vegetable around, they're not going to go looking for it.
Yeah. So you're developing an app that these young girls can use, these young adolescents can use. So ultimately, what the goal then is that these adolescents would use the app on their phones and kind of look at food in a different way. Then basically, so look at the Cheetos in a different way, for example, and look at the fruit in a different way, and then that would kind of change the way they behave when they see food. And so are there some, as you develop the app and so on, are there some surprises or some unexpected kind of things you learned as you were developing them?
Yeah, so when I was talking about some of the focus groups we were doing, we really wanted to know what community messages would be salient, because these are girls that they're not in cities. So a lot of the research about what teens care about we weren't sure if it would be applicable. And specifically when we were talking with girls from the Wyoming Girls School in Sheridan, Wyoming, what really, it surprised us, but when you reflect, you're like, that shouldn't have surprised me. But their biggest social concern was violence against women. And you're like, oh, wow, yes, that is a huge concern for these girls. And we know that domestic violence, it's a problem everywhere, but in rural communities, it can be kind of swept under the rug. And so we made a conscious effort to develop messaging that related to helping women and preventing violence against women through food-based decision-making. And so one of those was by eating fruits and vegetables, we can help small farmers, and small farms are often run by women. And we know that financial means are the best way to escape domestic violence. So by making healthier choices, you can help women escape poverty and escape domestic violence.
Yeah, more stable communities, more a bit higher levels of income and so on. So you mentioned also too that you're actually doing it in two communities. One predominantly, I think it was you mentioned here on your writings that you're looking at both a predominantly white community and also a predominantly Native American community. Are you seeing kind of similar messages there, or do you see, like, for example, if we were to roll this out more nationally, and there are different groups of people and living in different parts of the country and so on, do you see this as kind of generalizable, or you think you would have to kind of have it more targeted?
A little bit of both. There's, of course, things that annoy all teenagers. But I think when it really comes to the community-based messaging, that it's important that we look at the region that the teens are in. And it takes a little bit of background work to get an idea of what the teenagers are concerned about or interested in. But that is actually really exciting because with this kind of advent of AI and being able to take info and then quickly use an algorithm to tailor more information to a person, we're hoping that in probably not this iteration of the app, but to actually use the feedback a user gives us to make the messaging more salient and specific to them. And so we're really excited about those possibilities because, like, at first, basically, the app will ask you some general things and what you feel about this or that. And then as you interact with it more, it becomes more specific to you. And we know that when people are engaging with media, they prefer things that talk, look, and feel like themselves.
Yeah, we have a comment in the chat. Somebody is asking, can this app be adapted to different environments, including, for example, an urban inner city?
Yes, yeah. And that's really where that's kind of the next iteration is if we can get it to work in a rural community where everything is really spread out, I feel like that is kind of the most difficult way to get messaging out. So then once we get that framework, we can use these kind of algorithmic little tweaks and have it really just personalized to the user. And so like the messaging could then, they rate that they would, how much they like a message or don't like a message. And then we can use those ratings to say, oh, we gave them some messaging about, I don't know, how the food industry treats people like users, and they didn't like that message, but they did like this message about eating fruits and vegetables helps the environment. So we'll start tailoring more environmental messages to them.
Yeah, we're hearing more and more about precision medicine, precision nutrition, and so on. Precision, it makes sense that you can actually then kind of identify the different people out there, meet people where they're at in terms of their development, cognitive development, so on, and adolescence that one message may resonate more with one than the other. So that makes complete sense. So very interesting. And I know you're probably I think for your funding from ADA, you're probably what 1/3 of the way through. So there's still a long way to go, and we're looking forward to kind of hearing more and more kind of data coming out on that.
Yes. Yeah. So we are just gearing up. So we're finishing up the beta testing of the app. And we're going to do what I call a soft opening of the intervention starting in November. But as everyone probably knows, no one wants to think about an intervention or health or anything during the holidays. So we'll wait till the new year to really start that intervention process in both communities. And I'm really excited because using some of my startup funds from the university, I bought an RV trailer that we've retrofitted to be a mobile health lab. So we're both using mobile phones and mobile health labs to get where we have to be in a rural state. So that's what I'm really looking forward to in the new year.
That's very exciting. I think it's so important, with this epidemic we have of type 2 diabetes in youth. Anything that we could prevent that, any approaches we can have to kind of improve nutrition and lifestyle and communicate and meet young adolescents where they're at in terms of what the most resonates with them. It makes a lot of sense because we really need to kind of address this terrible epidemic that we're having of youth onset type 2 diabetes. So this is great. So looking forward to kind of hearing more about your research as we go forward. And I know we're almost out of time here. So thanks so much. This has been very exciting and great to have you on board in terms of funding, doing research, ADA funding your research, and look forward to kind of future successes. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the funding.
Awesome.